Hi, I'm Colin Dunn, and the subject today is emotional intelligence. A colleague of mine, Colonel Hughes, found himself in a city in Iraq leading a patrol of his soldiers through a city street. As he walked up the street, he noticed that there was a lot of angry Iraqis coming toward him from the other direction. Soon this mob prevented him from going any further up the street, and what Hughes did next was interesting. He shouted to his soldiers, "Do what I do." And then he took his M16 rifle and pointed the barrel of the weapon down. And then he kneeled in front of the mob. All the soldiers behind him did the same thing. The mob got quiet. And after a minute, Hughes slowly rose to his feet, the barrel of his weapon still pointing down like all his soldiers, and backed up the street from whence he came, extracting himself from what was a very tense situation. What was that? That was emotional intelligence in action. Because all emotional intelligence is being smart and effective about emotions, yours and those of others. What did Hughes do? He fought through his fear, his own emotion, to think clearly and read the emotions in the mob and in his own soldiers and do what was necessary to get the results that he wanted. Now, you may not be in combat, but you are in a job and you do have an out-of-work life. And talking about emotional intelligence can help you. It can help you better your life and better your career. What I want to talk about today are three elements of emotional intelligence I think will be helpful for you. The first element is, what is emotional intelligence? Or the actual measurement is called EQ, emotional quotient. And why should you care? Secondly, what is the impact of emotional intelligence in your life, at work and at home? And thirdly, what are some tips to grow your EI, your emotional intelligence, or your EQ, your emotional quotient? Let's start with, what is EI and why should I care? EI is simply this. It's being smart and effective about your emotions and those of others. There's two areas of EI I want to address. The first is your personal management, which involves you recognizing with self-awareness what emotions you are feeling. And then secondly, doing the right thing to get the right results based on those emotions. That's called self-management. The second area is social management. What is that? Well, that's being able to notice and read the emotions in other people. Know what other people in groups or individuals are feeling. And then based on relationship management, doing the right things to get the right results. Well, that's what EI is. Why should you care? Well, you should care because it's integral to your professional success. We've had 2 decades of studies about this, both in the public sector and in the private sector. And they've all come to the same conclusions. 90% of the top performers in every organization also score at the top in emotional quotient or emotional intelligence. 90% of them do that. It's also true that the people who score the highest in emotional intelligence, on average, earn $29,000 per year more than those who score in low emotional intelligence. So there's some great value to that, but it's even greater than that. If you have high emotional intelligence, you're going to have better relationships. You're going to have better morale on your team and better teamwork. Let's demystify this a little bit and talk about the difference between IQ and EQ, your intelligence quotient and your emotional quotient. And let's do that by looking at the anatomy of emotional intelligence over here on the chart. This is a perfect rendition of a human head. Okay, not really, but work with me here. In your head, you have that part of your brain which is called the prefrontal cortex. It's your seat of reason. It's the source of your IQ. That's the Stanford Binet 1910 developed emotional or intelligence test. and it measures how quickly you learn things, how quickly you analyze. In the center of your brain, there's an almond-shaped piece of tissue that's called your amygdala. It's called the amygdala, by the way, because that's the Greek word for almond. And your amygdala is your seat of emotion. You sense the emotions here, and then you transfer the information about those emotions through neural pathways to your brain. And sometimes those neural pathways are one-way streets, carrying neural packets of information from your amygdala to your cortex. And when they're one-way streets and the cortex doesn't have a say in how to respond to those emotions, you experience what is called an amygdala hijack. It's all happened to us. In the heat of the moment, when we're having a conversation with someone, we say something and we wish we could recall the words as soon as we said them. Or we're angry about something at work maybe, and we send an email, and as soon as we hit send, we wish we could recall the message. How well you communicate between the amygdala and the cortex is critical. If you could communicate not along one-way streets, but along four-way highways, where the cortex gets the final vote on how to react to your emotions, and you can do that well, then you will have a high EQ, or emotional quotient. Now, the other thing you need to know about your IQ is that 25% of your success, 25% of your success in your career is due to your IQ. But 75% of your success is due to your EQ, your emotional quotient. And the news gets even better. Because guess what? After age 15, it's difficult to get a higher IQ on the IQ test. But you can get better at emotional intelligence all your life. Now, at this point in the discussion, what often happens to me is I recognize that in the workshop, there are people who are not really on board. In fact, I would call some of those people emotional intelligence atheists, or at least skeptics. They don't believe in the studies, and they don't really believe in the science. If you're one of those people, let me ask you to take a test. In fact, this test is for everybody. Here's the way it works. Think of a leader you admire. Now, this leader has to be somebody you've personally worked for. Think in your working life, who is the leader you personally work for that you admire the most? And put that person in your head. Do you have that person in mind? Okay, here's the test. It's true, false. You admire that leader, in part, if not in whole, because of the way that person made you feel. True, right? Most people answer, yes, true. That is the case. You see that old song that says, "Love, what's love got to do with it? It is wrong. Emotions have everything to do with it." You know, one of my workshops, one senior leader came up to me during the break, and he said to me, "Colin, this is all very interesting and complex about emotional intelligence. Can't my people just come into work and leave their feelings at the door and then do their 8 to 10 hours of work and then leave and just pick up their feelings on the way out?" Well, you know the answer to that. They can't do that. Feelings are integral to our business life as well as our home life. Now, that's why we have emotional intelligence, and that's the importance of emotional intelligence. Let's talk about the impact of emotional intelligence. The first thing I want to talk about is emotional labor. You see this guy on the screen? He's a caricature of somebody in your workplace. Do you recognize him? Look closely. No, I'm just kidding. But we all know people who have looked like this at one point. In fact, we ourselves have looked like this at some point at work, have we not? You know, you've been to a meeting, maybe you got blamed unfairly for something, or maybe someone else got the credit for something you did, or you just have an unpleasant experience with somebody. When you go back to your desk, How much work are you getting done in the first 10 minutes? Not too much. While you're sitting there churning in negative emotional labor. The studies show that 20% of American workers' time is wasted in negative emotional labor. What if we could reduce that for ourselves or for our teams by even 5% to 15%? Would that make a difference? Well, of course it would. Of course it would. How do we do that? Well, we do that by knowing we can't always control what we feel, but we can control our response to what we feel. The other night, I went to a grocery store, a neighborhood grocery store. It was kind of late, and I picked up a couple of items right before closing. And I went to the checkout clerk. She had a big smile on her face, and she said, "Did you find everything you needed to here at Safeway? Because if you didn't, we'll help you find it." And it was a very warm and genuine smile. But behind the eyes, I just saw a little tint of fatigue. So I asked this question. I said, "How many customers have you smiled so sweetly at?" And asked them if they found everything. And she said, "You know, I think you're probably customer number 1,300 or 1,400. And I've been working for 12 hours. And in a few minutes when I go out to my car, I'm going to frown. I'm so tired of smiling." What was she doing? What she was doing was fighting through what she wanted to feel. Fighting through that feeling. Taking charge with her cortex. And doing what she needed to do for her job to get the results that she wanted. And that's our challenge with our personal emotions. Because it's not just about us. It's about those we work with. It's about those we are at home with. Because of this term, emotional contagion. What does that mean? Well, that just means emotionals are contagious. You know people that you've worked with who come in with a positive outlook every day, who uplift others just because of their attitude. You catch those positive emotions. You also may know people who come in with a dour look on their face, dragging in, maybe even have a toxic attitude that poisons the whole environment. You've got to be responsible for what your emotions are, not just for you, but for those of others as well. Let me introduce you to a concept called the emotional wake. Have you ever been to a yacht harbor? You're looking down on a yacht harbor, and you see the boats coming in. If you look carefully, you'll see signs on the water. One sign will say, as the boats get closer, 10 miles an hour. Then they get a little closer to the slips where they park, and it says 5 miles. And then there's a sign that says, "Make no wake." Why is that sign there? It's there because if it wasn't there, people might come in quickly. As they came in quickly, their wake would rock all the other boats. We all have an emotional wake at work and at home. I had a boss one time where there were 3 direct reports. I was one. The other 2 direct reports worked with him in another city. I would get into my car and drive to his location to have my meetings. And as it turned out, I had 90% of the operations, 90% of the resources, people, and money. The other 2 were policy wonks. But guess to whom the boss turned at those meetings if he needed any resources? Me. So I would go to the meetings, and I wanted my plans dashed. I would have my troops hosed, and I wouldn't be able to do what I wanted because things were taken away from me. Well, I got to tell you, when I drove home, I had an attitude. When I drove back to the office from that meeting, I would grip the steering wheel with my anger. Sometimes I think there's still marks in the steering wheel where I gripped it. And I would get out of the car, and I would go upstairs to my office where my 15 people who worked for me worked. And I would slam open the door and stomp into the office with a lot of noise and fanfare and go to the conference room and plop down in the seat, wait for somebody to come talk to me about the meeting. No. Was I helping people do their best at work? No. I was leaving a negative emotional wake. In fact, I was causing emotional labor in my own people, in my own workplace. So I learned I had to stop that. I had to stop that. And so what I did was I came up with a strategy, and the strategy was this. I knew I couldn't change my boss's behavior. He was still going to turn to me for resources. So what I did was I would park the car when I came back to the office, and I would turn the rearview mirror toward me. And I would look in that rearview mirror, and I would say to myself, Colin, you're going upstairs to work for 15 people and with 15 people that are doing the best they can for God and country, and they deserve a leader who can come up with the attitude that's going to help them do their best at work, not get in their way. So, sometimes I had to say that 3 times before I got my attitude right. But when I did, I came up with a better attitude, and I had a better result. Here's the message that I want you to take away from what I'm talking about. Take responsibility for your emotional wake. Take responsibility for your emotional wake at work and at home. Some of you might need to park your car before you go into your house and have a conversation with your rearview mirror until you get the right attitude that you need to go into that home and help people be the best that they can be. Now, that's the impact of emotional intelligence. Let's talk about tips to grow your EI, to grow your EQ, your emotional quotient. We've given you a couple of them. Here's a couple more. 1, personal management. In your personal management, what can you do differently to work with your emotions? You can identify the emotional triggers you have. We all have triggers. We have things that kind of set us off and make it difficult for, over here on the chart, remember this, for the cortex to control the amygdala. We have certain things that happen in our lives that cause us to lose cortex control or mental control over how we respond. Now, what we do is what's called a self-management 2-step. The self-management 2-step. The first step is identify those triggers on one side of a piece of paper. On the other side of the piece of paper, write down a strategy that you want to try, that you believe if you try this strategy, you will be able to better control your emotions the next time that trigger occurs. Now, when I was a young leader, I had a problem. My problem was that whenever I got chewed out, whenever I got dressed down, my immediate response was to go to the people that worked for me and dress them down too. Just pass that butt chewing right on through to the people who work for me. Did that help them do their best at work? Was that the most emotionally intelligent thing to do? Absolutely not. So I had to think about it. What could I do differently to control that trigger? And I decided to write down on the other side of the paper, on one side, getting chewed out and passing it on. On the other side was my strategy, which was what? Go talk to my deputy right after I got chewed out. After I was dressed down, go talk to my deputy and have a conversation about the best way to respond. And that worked for me. What's going to work for you? Whatever your trigger is at work or at home, that you know that when you get into this particular area, it sets off an emotion that you might not respond well to. Whatever that is, what's your strategy? Is it to take a walk? Is it to go get a drink of water? Whatever it is, write it down. Because when you write it down, you're using what part of your body? Let's go back to the chart. When you write it down, you're using your cortex. And because your cortex is part of writing it down and thinking thoughtfully through what it is you're trying to do, you'll have a better chance of controlling that amygdala when it sends those neurons up to your cortex and tells you, hey, do this. Your cortex can take charge. That's personal management. Let me give you one tip for social management. One of the best ways you can shut people down and turn people off is to be defensive. You know what happens when someone comes up to you and gives you a suggestion about how your team could operate better, or maybe a little bit of criticism on you personally. What's our natural reaction when that happens? It's shields up, phasers on, get ready to fire back and defend ourselves. Is that always the best response? Rarely it's the best response, because it takes whatever relationship you had with that person down a notch if you do that. What's the suggestion? Well, the suggestion is to avoid defensiveness, respond this way. Well, first of all, reframe the criticism or the suggestion just a little bit. Reframe it in your mind. And say to yourself, this is not an attack, this is not an attack, this is an opportunity to get better. And once you've reframed it in your mind, respond in this way. Show appreciation to the person for having mentioned it. Show respect to the person for having mentioned it to you at all, because it took some courage for that person to come to you most of the time and say whatever it is he or she had to say. And secondly, paraphrase or ask a question about it. Now, I must confess to you that this is one of those things that says easy, does hard. Now, I've written this and taught this for years, and yet a few years ago I found myself in Washington, D.C., in a big ballroom where there was 150 executives, and I was giving them a leadership talk. After I gave them the talk, 4 or 5 people came up to talk to me. The third person was a lady who said to me this. She said, I really enjoyed your talk, Colin. And I said, well, what do you do? I appreciate that. What do you do? And she said, I'm the president of the biggest marketing company in Washington, D.C. Well, let me tell you, for an entrepreneur like myself to meet something like that, wow, what a big deal that was. But she went on. She said, yes, but years ago I used to teach presentation skills. And you did something you shouldn't have done. You turned your back on the audience. Did I respond maturely with my cortex and say to that lady, hey, thanks for bringing that up. I didn't realize I did that. Did I follow up with this? Gee, you used to teach presentation skills. I make my living doing presentations. What else can you teach me? Even though I know this backwards and forwards, that's not how I responded. I responded this way. Well, I appreciate you saying that, but let me tell you something. Did you see how much room they gave me to walk up here? And there were people over on this side, and I had to turn my back if I was going to talk to those people, and I didn't want to ignore them. Excuse after excuse after excuse. After I finished defending myself, she smiled sweetly and walked away without leaving me her business card. And I saw thousands of dollars of opportunities walking with her. Says easy, does hard. But the good news is, the first time you do it well, the first time you conquer that instinct to be defensive, or you control yourself after a trigger happens, there's something that goes on in your brain, and one more time, let's go back to the chart. There's something that goes on in your brain that you need to know, and that is that those neural pathways, the first time you do that well, are going to widen just a little bit. And where they might be 2-lane right now, they might be 4-lane. And every time you do this successfully, you're going to get better at it. That's the good news. Well, I've given you a lot of information about emotional intelligence, and I know I've done it in a short amount of time. What we talked about was what EI is and why you should care. We talked about the impact of EI, and we gave you some tips on how to grow your EI. I hope they've been useful to you. Let me leave you with a couple of books to look at for further study. The first book on this list, Travis Bradberry's book, is one of the best books on emotional intelligence I have ever read. It has the bonus feature of providing an assessment you can take on yourself personally to measure your level of emotional intelligence, and a follow-up assessment after you've read the book and applied some of the concepts. The other book by Daniel Goleman is a classic. Daniel Goleman is the father, if you will, of all we know about emotional intelligence. He started the conversation all the way back in the 90s. And this book, Social Intelligence, I think is a great one to read as well. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation on emotional intelligence. I hope that some of the concepts and some of the suggested practices you can undertake will help you better your life and better your career. Thanks for watching.